So there were a lot of racist ideas about low-income people, about minorities, and about immigrants. Particularly, we see a lot of ideas about the poorest men and women, and that they were undeserving of charity, that they were undeserving of help. And we see this idea, this myth of meritocracy, and it's this idea that if we just work a little bit harder, if we just work a little bit longer, if we pick up an extra shift, then we will somehow earn enough money that we are able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and improve ourselves. With the increase of these charitable organizations, again, we really see that that is connected to continuing to elevate the middle class, the upper middle class, but does very little for those in society with the greatest needs. This concept of the undeserving poor is primarily, again, applied to minorities, racial minorities, to immigrant groups, particularly recent immigrant groups, and especially the Irish or immigrant groups who entered into the United States but did not immediately become assimilated and adopt American culture. We also see, as this is taking place, this increase in nativists, or this idea of nativism, in which Americans believe that Americans are the best group of people and that their ideas and their beliefs and their culture is the right way, and that it is vital that this either be adopted immediately or you are not American. So we see this strong concept of us versus them. Moving on, in the 1830s, we also see the rise of religious revivals, specifically that change and transform the Protestant churches in northern areas. The famous minister Charles Grandison Finney, or Charles Finney, adapted a lot of techniques that had been developed by Southern Methodists and Baptists to spread the evangelical messages to their audiences. Specifically, he placed an emphasis on this idea of social works, social responsibility, and doing good deeds. And the idea here was that good Christians would help those who had a need, that good Christians would do good social works in their communities. We see a population boom along the Erie Canal area, and with this increase in population, we again immediately know that we see an increase in diversity, increase in diverse ideas, diverse cultures, and different faiths. And with this increase in population, people begin to experience an increase in fear of rising sin. And so Charles Finney responded with prayer meetings that encouraged anyone who self identified themselves as a sinner to submit themselves to God. And so he would give very um, specific types of sermons or talks on what one might do to be a sinner. And a lot of those sins are connected to sort of cultural attributes or differences in faith. His efforts converted many influential members of the region's middle class. And so he and his converts committed themselves to preparing the way for what they believed would be the second coming of Christ. Again, because his converts are primarily middle class, this is a smaller portion of the population, which means that the majority of people, poor people, immigrant groups, and minorities are really left out from this religious movement, but that also means that they are most likely considered sinners. The religious revivals in the 1830s really impacted all Protestant denominations. So when we talk about Protestant denominations, we mean Methodists, Baptists, the AME churches, Pentecostal churches, churches of God, and others. It also impacted different ethnic, racial, and social groups. So this is not just confined to one class of people, but we see religious revival permeate social, racial, and ethnic lines. The moral outreach that we see stresses in these revivals an encouragement of reform movements throughout society, with temperance benefiting the most. So the common message, regardless of one's social class, regardless of one's ethnicity or race, is this idea of temperance, which is, of course, abstaining from alcohol. Here on this chart, you can see the major religious movements taking place in northern areas. Again, this is up in New York, so you can see Rochester, Buffalo, you can see Seneca Falls, which you may recall being important for women after the Revolution. You see different areas in the area over here, and what we see is that there is a diverse color of spots, which tells us that there's not just one denomination that is seeing a increase in participation and an increase in involvement, but it's spread all across this area. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but there is a line through here that indicates water, and this is the Erie Canal, and it goes all the way across this area. So again, we're able to move information, technologies, goods, and services along these waterways, but we're also able to spread ideas. I'd also like to point you to these red dots, which are the anti-slavery churches, and we see that there are many of these popping up all across this area as well. In the 1840s, Quakers and other religious groups stressed social reform and competed for followers with other evangelical religious movements. You may recall that the Quakers were conscientious objectors to the Revolution. Some Quakers, like Betsy Ross and her husband, ultimately did support the Americans or the Patriots during the Revolutionary War. However, most Quakers remained tried to stay out of this conflict. They tried to remain neutral in the revolution, but they historically have always been against slavery, and that is important about Quakers. Immigration resulted in an increase in the number of Catholic churches as well as an increase in the number of Jewish synagogues. Remember, the majority of people living in the United States who are not recent immigrants are Protestants. At the same time, we see the Mormon religion established in the 1830s by Joseph Smith. He created a theocracy with his religion, and the Mormon practice of polygamy produced much conflict with other non-Mormons. Polygamy is this idea that God encourages the male, the husband, to have more than one wife. There are instances where Mormon women have more than one husband, but one's blessings, one's rewards in heaven are connected to the number of wives and the number of children that they have. This conflict that's produced from this very, very radical idea ultimately leads to the death of Joseph Smith by a very angry mob while he was awaiting trial. He was executed outside of the law, and that leads most Mormon folks to migrate to the Utah Territory under the leadership of a man named Brigham Young. It is important to note that you probably see a lot of shows like Escaping Polygamy on television that talk about the practice of polygamy within the Mormon Church today. I would note that the official statement from the Mormon Church is that they do not support or condone polygamy. However, many of their members do continue to practice polygamy. Other groups are developed during the 1830s and the 1840s, usually primarily out of divisions from other groups. In particular, we see the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventists. Another popular idea that begins to develop and take place during the 1830s and into the 1840s is this concept of transcendentalism. Founded by Ralph Waldo Emerson, it's a spiritual school of thought based on the idea of a transcendent power of nature. The writings of Emerson really prove popular and allow this movement to spread. He travels and he gives lectures and talks. And transcendentalism really draws a lot of adherents to his hometown, which importantly and interestingly is Concord, Massachusetts. One important adherent or follower of transcendentalism is Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller became the first editor of the Transcendentalist Journal, which was called The Dial. She published her own ideas about transcendentalism as well as women's rights in other works. This is significant because as a female in the 1830s, there were minimal opportunities for women to have their voice heard. Another important follower of transcendentalism is Henry David Thoreau. He wrote about morality, conscious, and civil participation in a work called Civil Disobedience, which was about very simple lifestyles, natural harmony, and social justice. Importantly, Henry David Thoreau made a statement regarding slavery because he did speak out against slavery. And he wrote that the only just place for a just person is in prison when the laws are unjust. That is important for many reasons because there are many people who actively work against slavery in the North as well as in the South. But another man who you might be familiar with, named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., quoted Henry David Thoreau when he was in the Birmingham jail. So these ideas of transcendentalism, these ideas of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson have a legacy that extends well beyond their lifetimes, well beyond the 1830s, and even to the present day. Artists also begin to make connections between the unique aspects of natural beauty in the United States or in America and the unique culture of power in the United States. In particular, what they see is that this connection between the natural beauty is part of what gives the United States its lure to other people, but also gives it power. And we'll pause here.